It's 12:25 a.m. The Cunard liner RMS Carpathia is mostly blacked out, her saloons darkened, passengers soundly asleep. On the bridge, the few officers on watch brace themselves against the biting cold. Overhead, uncountable millions of stars twinkle and shine. The ocean is still and flat, shining like a mirror. Harold Cottam, 21, is the ship's lone Marconi wireless operator. He's just about to get ready for bed. It's been a long day monitoring the radio traffic mid-Atlantic, but out of habit, before going to sleep, he picks up his headset for one last listen. He's surprised to hear that the brand new luxury liner Titanic, which for the past few hours on end has been sending out passenger messages, has fallen silent. So he sits down at his desk to call up the bigger ship's wireless operator. "Good morning, old man," he taps out on his key. "Do you know that there are dispatches for you at Cape Cod?" The response he receives is chilling. "CQD, CQD, SOS, SOS, CQD, SOS. Come at once. We've struck a berg." Cottam cannot believe what he is hearing. "Should I tell my captain?" he asks, incredulous. "Yes, quick," comes the reply. Carpathia has just found itself caught up in one of the most infamous disasters at sea. Cottam doesn't know it yet, but that brief exchange with Titanic has sparked a race against time that will see the little Cunard Oceanliner push itself to the absolute limit. And soon, they will have their very own brush with the ice. On Thursday, April 11th, 1912, RMS Carpathia, then 10 years old, had pulled away from the Cunard Pier at New York, bound for the Mediterranean. At the time of her launch in 1902 at Swan Hunter Shipyard in Wallsend, England, Carpathia had been one of the larger ships in the Cunard fleet, displacing 8,700 tons. But a decade later, she was vastly outclassed by the line's other great vessels like Lusitania and Mauretania. She still had an important role to play though. Alongside her similarly sized running mates, she was a modest, comfortable and practical ship for Cunard intended to carry vast amounts of cargo across the Atlantic, as well as a small complement of passengers across two classes. On the bridge in April 1912 was veteran skipper Arthur Rostron, who'd started his career at sea nearly 30 years earlier. He joined Cunard as a junior officer on the Umbria, and over the next few years served across the Cunard fleet, being promoted all the time. His first passenger ship command was Pannonia, but then, in January 1912, he was given command of the larger and more refined Carpathia. The ship was rugged and reliable, with a reputation for good seakeeping and little rolling, thanks to her proportionally wide beam. Rostron found himself in command of a happy, reliable and popular combination cargo passenger liner whose career until then had been thankfully uneventful and typical. But for Rostron and the Carpathia, things were about to change. Carpathia had spent 3 quiet days at sea, steaming along on her steady service speed of 14 knots. Aboard her were some notable passengers, including the American painters Emma and Colin Campbell Cooper. Her 300-strong crew was led by 6 officers, which included, in their midst, a promising young man named James Bissett. He was Carpathia's second officer that voyage, and he would one day go on to become Cunard's Commodore, commanding the likes of Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth in the Second World War and beyond. But in April 1912, he was merely an aspiring young officer on the bridge of Carpathia as she traversed the Atlantic on a Great Circle course from Sandy Hook to Gibraltar. A Great Circle course is the shortest possible route between 2 points across the curve of the Earth. Carpathia, whose passengers were not in any huge rush, offset her modest speed by sailing a Great Circle course, managing about 336 miles on the 3rd day at sea. By April 14th, the liner had made it about 1,000 miles out of New York and was 3 days into her 10-day crossing. Then, at 9 a.m, something interesting happened. Carpathia received an ice warning. At this early stage of the wireless apparatus's life, the Marconi device largely existed for the benefit of passenger messengers and radio operators who were mostly tech enthusiasts, not unlike today's computer experts, or employees of the Marconi company directly. They were not expected to be on station at all times, and on smaller liners there was usually just one Marconi operator aboard. Ships outside of visual range weren't a danger, and because of this their communique was more of a curiosity than considered a critical piece of information. But one notable exception to this rule were ice warnings, which Marconi operators passed between one another. It wasn't necessarily in their job description, but the fear of icebergs and pack ice at sea, especially in early and mid-spring as glaciers began to melt and carve off, was enough to encourage the swapping of mutually beneficial information. Carpathia's first ice warning on the morning of the 14th of April came from her Cunard fleetmate, Coronia, westward bound from Liverpool to New York. It warned of a large spread of ice, and it was received by Harold Cottam aboard Carpathia, the only wireless operator for the ship. He passed the warning onto the bridge. Captain Rostron had considered the warning. Ice at this time of year was to be expected. "It seems to be a big field," he said. "Keep a sharp lookout. Carry on." As the day proceeded and Second Officer Bissett's 8 to 12 watch gradually came to a close, the air temperature began to drop, chilled by cold currents from the ice field to the north. Carpathia was well south of the ice field, and it was a bright, clear day, so there was no real cause for alarm. After a quiet day at sea, as the sun set and the sea became a flat calm, more ice warnings had arrived from Coronia, Baltic, Californian, and finally, at 9:40 p.m, the Mesaba. Their messages clearly marked out a monstrous field of ice, about 80 miles or 128 kilometers long to the north of Carpathia's position. As Carpathia steams underneath it, the air temperature drops by 10 degrees in less than an hour. By evening, though, another vessel had entered Cottam's wireless range. It was the White Star liner Titanic on her maiden voyage, and her wireless operators were hard at work relaying private passenger correspondence, greetings, and stock reports. Titanic had acknowledged the Mesaba's warning, and Rostron chatted with Bissett on Carpathia's bridge about the ice field. "I suppose that the Titanic will have to slow down," he said, "or steer a more southerly course than the usual track. She'll be late to New York. It's hard luck on her maiden voyage." Rostron, a cautious and experienced captain, assumed that Titanic's commander, Captain Edward John Smith, would avoid the ice field, but he was wrong. On Titanic's bridge, Smith has been lulled into a false sense of security by the spectacular, bizarre sea state and the atmospheric conditions. The night air is chilling, but the sea is a flat calm, like a sheet of glass. There's no moon, which makes it difficult to discern on the horizon where sea ends and sky begins. Smith decided that the clarity of the night will mean that hazards can be spotted in time, and he turns in for bed, maintaining speed and course and telling the watch to wake him up should a haze come up. Then, and only then, would he have to slow down for the night or stop. Titanic presses onward into the night, and far south of them, Carpathia does the same. The passengers have turned in for bed, and Carpathia's saloons and deck lights are mostly extinguished. At about 11 p.m, Cottam had been in Carpathia's wireless office listening to Titanic's stream of passenger messages when the liner, Californian, cut in to announce that they had stopped very near to Titanic's position, surrounded by massive icebergs. Her captain decided it was best to proceed in the morning once the sun had risen. Titanic's wireless operator, Jack Phillips, had blasted back over the airwaves, shut up, I'm busy working," and that was the last of it. On Carpathia, Cottam had hung up his earphones and started to get ready for bed, and Californian's lone wireless man did the same thing. Cottam relayed all he had learnt to Rostron on Carpathia's bridge. He'd picked up signals from around 5 ships in his range, including, just faintly, Titanic's sister Olympic, which he figured to be about 500 or 600 miles away. Rostron thanked him, and Cottam retired to his cabin. The captain gazed out at the dark, ethereal horizon, The conditions were beautiful, but the intense cold and the singular stillness seemed unearthly, almost sinister. Ever the pious man, Rostron said a silent prayer, and then he turned to Second Officer Bissett. "You may sight the Titanic if she bears southward to avoid the ice," he says. "I don't suppose she'll try to run through it when the growlers and bergs are so thick that the Californian has stopped for the night. Wonderful thing, wireless, isn't it?" Bissett agreed, and Rostron went on. "We're in clear water here, but keep your eyes peeled all the same." Bissett nodded, and Rostron, maybe feeling the majestic power of the ocean in that moment, made one final observation. "I'm sorry for Smith of the Titanic," he said. "After all the newspapers boasting she's proved a slow coach on her maiden voyage, and now this ice field will make him lose more time if he steers to the southward around it, as I suppose he will. She must be a wonderful ship, but all their newspaper bragging seems a kind of blasphemy, claiming that she's unsinkable and all that kind of thing." There was a moment of silent agreement, the wind whistling around their heads. Then Rostron simply said, "The night's clear, and I'll turn in." The skipper gave his orders and went to his berth below. Bissett was now senior officer on the bridge. 4 bells were struck, 10 p.m, the usual cry of all's well from the lookout. The watch slipped by, and Bissett, the men on the bridge, and in the crow's nest were doing all their best to keep out the horrendous cold. At midnight, 8 bells were struck, all was well, and Bissett was back to his cabin, glad at last to be out of the freezing chill. Horace Dean, Carpathia's first officer, replaced Bissett for the middle watch. The sky and the sea stretched on for endless eternity, lit only by the eerie, twinkling stars in their countless millions. Then, racing up behind him, Dean hears heavy footsteps, and a breathless Cottam is wide-eyed, panting in front of him. Cottam breathlessly tells Dean the situation, and then races below to the cabin where Captain Rostron is just dozing off. Cottam bursts in with Dean closely following him, and before Rostron can tell him off for the breach in discipline, the wirelessman tells his captain what's going on. "Are you certain?" Rostron asks. "Quite certain," Cottam responds impatiently. "Titanic is sinking." It's now 12:30, and Rostron steps onto the bridge. He has immediately grasped the severity of the situation, and he begins to roar his orders. "Stop her," he says. "Send for the chief engineer. Send for the chief officer and call all the officers. Call all hands on deck and get ready to swing out the boats." Bissett's cabin is just abaft the bridge, and this last order rouses him from his dozing. He rushes out on deck. This is the situation. Titanic reports her position to be about here, but history would prove the given coordinates to be inaccurate by about 25 kilometers or 15 miles west-northwest. At the very least, this inaccurate position would still put Carpathia in sight of the ship's lights as she approached. When Carpathia received the wireless distress call, she was here, about 60 or 70 miles southeast. A handful of other ships are scattered nearby. Parisian, about 50 miles away, has her wireless set turned off for the night. Mount Temple received the distress call, but she's an older, slower ship and she can barely crack 11 or 12 knots. Californian is closest to Titanic, basically right on top of her, but her wireless set has been turned off and she's stopped for the night surrounded by an ice field. Even if she could figure that Titanic was in peril, it would take precious time to put pressure back on her boilers and get her engines turning. To save Titanic's passengers and crew, Rostron knows that he will have to act drastically and even endanger his own ship by sailing at full speed for the site of the sinking, and therefore straight into the very same ice field that Titanic has just encountered. He weighs this all up in his mind, and he decides to act. Carpathia will rise to the challenge. Word is passed around, men rouse sleepy from their bunks, and as they pull on extra layers of warm clothes, Carpathia has already swung her head around, her course altered north 52 west, and her engines thundering full speed ahead. In minutes, all of Carpathia's officers have gathered in the chart room, and Rostron gives them a terse rundown of the situation. He's plotted out Titanic's position and the ice field Clearly, the situation is dire. "The Titanic has struck a berg," Rostron says, "and she's in distress 58 miles from here on the bearing North 52 West. We'll make our utmost speed in going to her rescue. Call out an extra watch in the engine room and raise every ounce of steam possible. We may reach her in 4 hours. All seamen on deck for sharp lookout and to swing out the boats. We may have to pick up 2,000 or more people. All stewards on duty to prepare blankets, hot coffee, tea, and soup. The doctors to stand by in the dining rooms. All gangway doors to be opened, boatswain's chairs slung out at each gangway, pilot ladders over the side, forward derricks to be rigged and steam put on the winches, and oil to be got ready to quiet the sea if needed. Rockets are to be got ready. Everything must be done as quietly as possible so as not to alarm our own passengers." If the officers had been sleepy before this, they were now standing with intense alertness. Given their assigned tasks, they rushed to their stations, rousing the doctors and stewards quietly but urgently. Across the ship, Carpathia, which had minutes earlier been blacked out and asleep, begins to awaken as lights turn on and people get to work. Within minutes, Carpathia's plodding expansion steam engines are roaring, the engineers working their magic. To maximise their steam pressure and get every bit of speed out of their machines that they can, Rostron calls on his chief engineer. He makes an unprecedented order. Anything that might drain the steam pressure is to be shut off. The heating and the hot water system all cut. He tells the chief to pile every ounce of steam onto the boilers that he can. The group of sailors, led by the boatswain's mate, are oblivious to the drama and they're en route to do some routine maintenance, but Rostron barks out at them to prepare the ship's lifeboats. The sailors are aghast, but Rostron realises their alarm. "It's all right," he says, "we're going to another vessel in distress." Rostron turns to his charts and he can feel his ship vibrating underfoot. Even at full clip, he expects to enter the ice field at 3 a.m, maybe reaching Titanic's position after 4 hours. But those 4 hours will not be easy. The veteran commander knows that on a moonless night like this, the icebergs will be difficult, nearly impossible, to spot. But there's nothing for it. He's conforming to that ages-old tradition of the sea that no distress call should go unheeded. He is a pious man, and he puts his faith in his God that Carpathia wouldn't endure the same fate as Titanic. Carpathia's wild dash through the black night has begun. At 12:45, Cottam messages Titanic, telling them that Carpathia is on the way and would be due to arrive in 4 hours. Phillips on the Titanic simply thanks him for this, and Cottam decides it's best not to jam the airwaves, and he refrains from asking any further questions, listening instead to the radio traffic as the disaster plays out. Around Carpathia, passengers are naturally awakened by the frantic activity, the clunking overhead as lifeboats are removed from their chocks and swung out, and the extra vibration as her engines surge. It creates some sense of alarm for a few, but then the word slowly gets around that Titanic is in danger and Carpathia is racing to her rescue. On the bridge, Captain Rostron knows that his vessel might need to take on Titanic's entire complement of 2,200 passengers and crew. He sends for his surgeon, Dr. Francis McGee. The night is freezing, the water is black, and the pair know that they may have to deal with hundreds of near-frozen, exhausted, and injured survivors. McGee is to transform Carpathia's dining saloons into first aid stations and triage areas. Stimulants and restoratives, the entire first aid supply, are to be dispensed out and made ready. 2 other doctors who speak Hungarian and Italian are each assigned a station and told to make ready for second and third class passengers. Even getting hundreds of people aboard the Cunard ship would be no easy task. She has no accommodation ladder to swing down to water level, so instead survivors will need to clamber up Jacob's ladders, netting, or, if they're unable to climb, be hauled up with pulleys and ropes. Fortunately, Carpathia's gangway doors are enormous, a type of double door which both swing outwards. Carpathia's purser is told to assemble a team to each cover a different gangway and see to the safe loading of survivors from the water. The crew have already swung the huge doors open and begun to rig block and lines with canvas bags to haul people up, as well as cargo nets to act as a kind of rope ladder. The purser and his team will need to triage the survivors, ascertain their class, and then direct them to a different saloon on the ship where they can be seen to by the surgeons. As frantic preparations are made on Carpathia, by 1:25 a.m, the situation on board Titanic has escalated. Phillips messages that women and children are being put away in the lifeboats, but far below his wireless office, water is already lapping at Titanic's nameplate. The ship does not have much time to live. On board Carpathia, the crew's eyes struggle against the intense frost of the air as they keep their sharp lookout. All of Rostron's orders have been completed and the ship is moving ahead at full speed. Her regular service speed was a modest 14 knots, but it seems likely that her engineers may have been able to squeeze 15 or 16 knots out of the engines. Rostron cannot know for certain whether or not his own ship will fall foul of an iceberg like Titanic had. He puts his faith entirely in good fortune and his crew's keen eyes. He posts additional lookouts to the bow, lower than the bridge and the crow's nest, where they're more likely to see the black mass of an iceberg against the horizon. A dozen pairs of eyes search the inky darkness for ice. Further aft, the crew have turned Carpathia's lounges and smoking rooms into massive dormitories. Masses of blankets have been gathered and piled near the gangways. Hot coffee and soup begin to steam piping hot and they're ready to be served out. It might not seem like much, but a hot meal after hours in the freezing darkness could do a great deal in reviving a survivor. Despite the quiet with which the orders were carried out, curious passengers begin to emerge from their staterooms where they're confronted by informed stewards who can tell them what is happening and keep them out of the way. First-class passenger Lewis Ogden approaches a quartermaster that he's already met and asks what's up. "We're going north like hell," the man says, and he's right. Carpathia is roaring through the water faster than she's ever gone before, but will it be quick enough? At 1:45, Phillips on Titanic sends a chilling message. "Come as quick as possible," he says, engine room filling up to the boilers. Until now, Rostron had expected Titanic to be badly damaged, but he assumed that she would remain afloat, that all of her passengers and crew and her mail and light cargo would need to probably be transferred efficiently to the Carpathia and any other ships which arrived on station. But now he's confronted with a horrifying possibility that there may not be a ship left afloat by the time Carpathia arrives. There's nothing for it but to charge ahead into the night and pray for the best. By 1:45 a.m, Cottam notices that Titanic's signal strength has become increasingly weaker. The messages become garbled and faint, and then 20 minutes later, at 2:05 a.m, the wireless communique has stopped entirely, and Titanic is silent. For Carpathia's crew, the lookouts straining their eyes in the darkness, the engineers working at fever pitch in the engine room, that night's activity is intense, and Second Officer Bissett would go on to recall that their nerves were as taut as could possibly be. Would they find Titanic down by the head and passengers away in lifeboats? Would they arrive on station only to see the mighty ship slip beneath the waves? Only time could tell. It seems like an eternity that Carpathia roars onward into the night, until about 2:35 a.m, Captain Rostron bellows with anxious excitement. "There's his light," he calls. "He must be still afloat." There, far away in the distance, is a faint green dot. Carpathia has done it. It must be Titanic's starboard green running light. The ship alters course for port and bears down on the position. She begins to fire company rockets at 15-minute intervals to show that help is at hand. But at 2:45 a.m, Bissett is keeping lookout on the starboard bridge wing when he catches sight of stars reflecting off of something directly ahead. He recognises it in an instant. It's a towering mountain of ice. He roars out a warning, and the quartermaster swings Carpathia's helm hard around. She slows in the water and narrowly misses the iceberg which slips by her bow. When Rostron decides he's cleared the berg, he brings his ship up to full speed again, but then another iceberg spotted, and then another one, and another. It's the ice field. Carpathia now begins to zigzag between ever-growing numbers of bergs. It must seem incredible to Rostron that Titanic's master had sailed his ship at full speed into this dense field of ice. Smaller growlers scrape along Carpathia's hull plates. "Hey fellows," calls out one lookout, "look at that polar bear scratching himself with a chunk of ice." There's nervous laughter. At 3:30 am, there's nothing else for it. The ship's speed is reduced from half to slow ahead as the going gets tougher. Now, on the horizon, green flares have been spotted at random intervals, but there's no sight of Titanic's masthead or her navigation lights. Carpathia is right on top of Titanic's given position. She should be visible. And then, at 4 am, a solid green flare is spotted low on the horizon, and as the sky slowly begins to lighten with the early morning, Carpathia inches towards it. The truth is revealed. The green lights are flares lit by survivors in tiny wooden lifeboats. Carpathia has arrived at the scene, but Titanic is nowhere in sight because she is over 2 miles beneath their feet. Rescuing this first lone boat is itself no easy task. Rostron intended to take its occupants on board from his port side, where the Carpathia's bulk would provide shelter from the breeze and the choppy seas, but at the last minute, an iceberg loomed out of the murky light, and Carpathia was still moving slowly ahead, with her engines stopped, carried by her momentum. Rostron puts the helm hard over to starboard and swings his ship around so the little boat arrives on Carpathia's starboard side. Disaster has only narrowly been averted. "Go over the side with 2 quartermasters," he says, "and board her as she comes alongside. Fend her off so that she doesn't bump, and be careful that she doesn't capsize." The wooden boat is only 25 feet long, and to curious onlookers aboard the Oceanliner, it must look like a toy drifting all alone on the vast Atlantic Ocean. It was one of Titanic's emergency cutters, swung out at all times in the event of a man overboard, and huddled on the boat's thwarts are about 18 people, numbed by cold and feeling seasick. On the lifeboat's bow is a metal nameplate reading Titanic. Its occupants, having spent that whole dark, moonless night alone in the middle of the ocean, stare up in bewilderment at the black steel hull and tall red funnel of a Cunard steamship. One passenger in the boat, a woman, cries out hysterically, "The Titanic has gone down with everyone on board." Carpathia's passengers stare wide-eyed at the tiny wooden lifeboats as they begin to appear like specks on the murky early morning horizon. They come slowly closer, drawn to the side of the steamship, some barely occupied but others overloaded deep to their waterline. The preparations made by Carpathia's crew prove remarkably well thought out. The weak and the injured are hoisted aboard. They're comforted by crew and stewards who rush blankets over their shivering bodies and hand them the hot cups of coffee and soup. The rich and the poor spill into the gangways covered in flecks of ice. One man, an officer, makes his way to Carpathia's bridge where he comes face to face with his rescuer, Captain Rostron. "Where is the Titanic?" the captain asks. "Gone," says the officer. "He's Titanic's fourth, Joseph Boxall. She went down at about 2:30. His breaking voice betrays his deep distress. The bridge is stunned into silence. After a minute, Rostron asks, "Were many people left on board when she sank?" Boxall's voice quivers with emotion. "Hundreds and hundreds," he bellows. "Perhaps 1,000, perhaps more." Rostron thanks him and quietly guides him below to get warmed by coffee. On Carpathia's decks and in her saloons, passengers collapse, exhausted and emotionally overcome by horror or even sheer relief. Lewis Ogden, the first-class passenger from Carpathia, tries to hand coffee to a pair of women sitting quietly in the corner. "Go away," one barks. "We've just seen our husbands drown." Rescue work goes on with a deathly quiet, interrupted only by the quiet sobs of separated children, husbands, wives, mothers and fathers. Carpathia's house flag is lowered to half-mast. In the wireless shack, Harold Cottam comes face to face with an unexpected presence. It's his friend, one of Titanic's wireless operators, Harold Brady. His colleague, Phillips, has been lost in the sinking and his feet are frostbitten, but Bride still insists that he can help in relaying radio traffic. At 8:30 am, some 8 hours since Carpathia had first picked up Titanic's distress calls, the final boat is found and its occupants are brought aboard. Survivors had been watching keenly for their missing friends or loved ones, but now the finality hits home that this is the last lifeboat, and if their friends or loved ones are not aboard, then they're not likely to have made it. Rostron had at first expected to find Titanic still afloat. He was ready to bring 2,200 people aboard his ship, but instead he's found a bedraggled group of wooden lifeboats, and not 2,200 souls, but 705 cold and weary people who haunt Carpathia's decks. He now has a decision to make. Does he remain to trawl for bodies in the water, or should he make for the nearest landfall, Halifax? He could rendezvous with Olympic. She'd be much better suited to caring for the masses of humanity now crowding his ship, but then the realization hits that the sight of Titanic's near-identical sister ship would be more than the shattered survivors could bear. To remain on site and collect hundreds of bodies from the water would have the same effect. There could be no other choice than to turn back around for Titanic's destination port. Bear away from the wreckage, he orders, and Carpathia makes a southwesterly course. It would take until noon for the ship to clear the field of ice that had sent Titanic to the bottom. The Cunard liner is quiet. There's no laughter, only numbed shock. Their crew have achieved something remarkable. They had safely navigated at full speed through a pitch black night surrounded on all sides by ice to arrive in time to rescue the entire complement of Titanic's survivors, but now there could be no celebration, only the quiet, somber voyage to America that 705 people aboard had begun 5 days earlier in excitement and pleasure. Carpathia steams slowly away from the site, icebergs glistening all around her in the early morning sun. It's April 15th, 1912. Carpathia's rescue mission has ended.